And I'll then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention for 30-minute debates. Order, order. Jerome Mayhew to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morrison. It's great to see you in your place. This is a debate about nature-based solutions for farmland flooding. And there's going to be two areas that I want to discuss. And before I start, Dr. Morrison, I have to draw your attention to my declaration of interest. I'm a director of a farming company. I don't claim to be a farmer, look at my hands, but I am directly involved in farming, and I benefit from some of the measures, or I could benefit from some of the measures that I'm proposing. So there are two areas that I want to discuss. The first one is the impact on farms of flooded fields and what should be done to help them. And the second one is the impact of agricultural flooding on other areas of flood risk and what should or could be done to incentivise farmers to help ameliorate flooding elsewhere by accepting flooding in some aspects of their farms. But before I go into that, Dr. Morrison, it is necessary to look at some of the background, give you some of the stats to help to paint the picture. 74% of the total floodplain in the United Kingdom is agricultural land. And it's perhaps no surprise, because of the centuries of flooding and recession, that this forms some of the richest agricultural land that we have. In fact, 60% of our best and most versatile land is on the floodplain. And as a result of that, this argument about this debate that we have about what should happen about floodplains, whether they should be allowed to flood, whether they should be allowed to rewild, whether they should be retained for agricultural use, is absolutely central to the very significant and increasingly political debate that we have all been having about food security. The incidences of flooding are increasing. We can argue, but we don't need to today, about the reasons behind that. But it's certainly the case that last winter there were more than 1,000 flood warnings for farmland. Now that was a record high. And as any farmer will tell you, particularly on the east of England, last spring the land was absolutely inundated with water. It was impossible for farmers to get on the fields until much later than normal. That had a knock-on impact on our sowing and a consequential impact on yield for this year. And then more recently than that, we've just had the New Year's flooding right across the country. So you can see from this pattern, and a much longer one, which we don't need to go into, that there is now a norm. And if you look at the new and updated forecast of the change in our weather patterns that we should experience through global warming, whilst yes, it's true it will be warmer and drier in the summers, the expectation, it certainly so far seems to be borne out by reality, is that the winters will be wetter and that they will have greater incidence of intense rain, the kind of rain that leads to flooding. And so we do need action to fix what is a changing situation. Now, when you're talking about flooding on farms, the first argument that I raise, Dr. Morrison, is that watercourses need to be cleared. It's not every drainage that needs to be slowed down in order to prevent flooding elsewhere, although that's very fashionable, and I fear some of that fashion has found itself into the way of the Environment Agency. It's crucially important that drainage which is intended to remove water from productive farmland is cleared regularly, either by the Environment Agency or that they get out of the way and allow local farmers to do it on their behalf. So farmland is not free flooding for the Environment Agency elsewhere. That is a crucial distinction between what the Environment Agency may have planned for flood defences lower down in the watercourse and the very necessary requirement that that best and most versatile land continues to be used effectively for food production. So we need to identify potential flood relief, areas where the quality of the land is less good, where in negotiation with landowners, with farmers, you can identify historic floodplains, perhaps flood meadows like one of the very few traditional flood meadows which are still in existence in my constituency at Sculthorpe Meadow. And there's also on the Wenston, there's another one. That's part of only 1,100 hectares of traditional flood meadow which is still in existence in the country. There, you can have agreements with the Environment Agency taking advantage of the funding that's available from central government, which I'll come on to in a minute. And there's a potential for farmers to benefit from allowing areas of the land, lower quality land, to accept flooding for the benefit of others. But I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Member for securing today's debate, which is really important, and important also not only to rural communities and farmers, but also to people living downstream in larger towns. Would he agree with me that the sort of discussions he's describing need to be held with landowners quite far up the catchment area towards the top of a large river catchment? So, for example, in our area in the Thames Valley, the ideal position would be if farmers in the Cotswolds or in the northern part of Oxfordshire were consulted about this, rather than further downstream in the central part of Berkshire.
The Honourable Gentleman is entirely right, and it's one of the beauties of the Environmental Land Management Scheme brought in by the last government, that it had 3 stages. You had the in-field, the SFI, countryside stewardship, the sort of in-farm elements, and then you had the landscape recovery tier, which anticipated exactly that. I think I describe it as in-valley projects. And it's right that you should be looking right across a watercourse in those discussions, but they need to be done in consultation with the farmers and not have it imposed upon them by a lack of drainage on the part of the Environment Agency. So where there is flooding of productive farmland, it's necessary for the government, in my view, to build on the Farming Recovery Fund, which was instigated by the last Conservative government, which provides up to £25,000 per farm per uninsured loss event. And I want to put on record that I welcome the government's announcement that they will provide an additional £10 million to that fund, but that is the start, not the end, in my view, of what needs to be done, so that farmers who do suffer loss, I will at the end of this sentence, but where farmers do suffer loss to their farming land, their productive livelihood, that they are compensated where that loss is uninsurable, and I will give way.
For giving way and for securing this really important debate. I represent Glastonbury and Somerton. Part of my constituency lies on the Somerset Levels and Moors. Somerset is always at the forefront of flooding. In fact, 91% of Glastonbury and Somerton is agricultural land, so we depend on our farmers to store flood water on their land to prevent our homes from flooding. So does the Honourable Member agree with me that we should properly compensate our farmers when they do store water on land, and we should encapsulate schemes with an extra £1 billion a year, so farmers have the resources that they need to provide that resilience, not only into farming, but also to our homeowners and residents across the county?
I'm grateful for that intervention as well. And the Honourable Lady is right in concept in that where there is uninsured loss of productive farmland caused by flooding, then the last government was absolutely right to create the Farming Recovery Fund to compensate, at least in part, for those losses. And when it comes to flooding by agreement, if I can describe it as that, which happens on the Somerset Levels as part of the Landscape Recovery Agreement there, called the Somerset Levels Project, then that as well needs to come with sufficient funding under the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And I will address wider funding concerns a bit later in my speech. So, farms can have a role in minimising flooding. They can do that in-farm as well as further down the watercourse. But the government must continue to work with the Conservatives and with the scheme that the previous government set up, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, to recognise and support this. Very briefly, Dr. Morrison, we start at the top of the watercourse. Where available, there's upland peatland restoration. Peat bogs are essentially, when they're in good condition, they're like giant sponges, not just for water, but also for carbon storage. When they're in poor condition, the cycle goes into reverse, both for water, but also for carbon emission. There are riparian buffers which can be planted and maintained next to watercourses. They slow the flow of water off the land and also absorb a percentage of it. And then, more importantly, more interesting for, I was about to say farmers like me, and I'm not a farmer, but for people involved in farming, there is the in-field. The more exciting part is the in-field developments, which are increasingly becoming mainstream, developing from the regenerative agricultural movement. And that focus is based around soil management. So we always used to describe it as the heavy metal approach, Dr. Morrison, which isn't referring to our taste in music, but about plough, drill and till, which has been the traditional, inverted commas, method of agriculture, but certainly since the Second World War, where your inputs come out of a sack and you rely on horsepower in order to manipulate the soil. The problem with that is, apart from its very significant impact on biodiversity, which is a debate in its own right, but it leads to collapsed soil structures, and then you need to go into subsoiling, and the more metal you use, the more heavy metal you need to use, and it destroys or very substantially limits the ability of the soil to absorb and then retain water. So this has the short-term impact of increasing runoff and leading to flash flooding in a way that didn't happen when I was a boy. But it also has a knock-on impact in the summer, which is if you have a soil structure that is not capable of absorbing and retaining water in the winter, then you become water hungry in the spring and summer, and you get parching in a way that is, affects yield as well and costs money in irrigation to compensate for. So there is a movement, it's called the regenerative or Min-till movement, where this approach has been challenged, and that by minimizing the impact on soil, the disturbance of soil through metal, that you can increase and develop and retain the soil structure, both that creates spaces in the soil in which to absorb water, but it also has a secondary impact, which is the mycorrhizal interaction of live roots, which secures carbon and improves the sponginess of the soil as well. All of these things are great because as you increase absorption, you also reduce the speed at which that water is emitted back into the watercourse. Allied to that is cover crops during the winter, having live roots in the water and a structure that prevents runoff, prevents soil erosion in the winter, also enormously important. Contour ploughing. So this is having, as a matter of course, ploughing along the contour, not up and down the contour. It's very basic physics, but that helps to retain water on the land and slows its emission down into the watercourse. These are all things which the farm in field can do to help both their own cause, but also to retain water for lower down the watercourse. And then there's the second option, which is where you have water, land which is less valuable quality, not best and most fertile land, there is a potential to accept seasonal water along the lines of a traditional meadow, water plain meadow. There is the opportunity to re-wriggle, not sure that's the technical term, but to re-wriggle watercourses to slow down the flow of water in the appropriate areas. And by accepting floodwater, you have the opportunity to re-establish traditional meadows, but you do need to be compensated. One does. The farmers need to be compensated for that because they're giving up productive land, albeit less productive land, in order to provide a social good. And the whole concept of elms was public money for public goods. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and thank him for securing this important debate. Farmers in the Flip Valley in mid-Bedfordshire are concerned that repeated flooding and waterlogging has left large areas of farmland basically unfit for agricultural purposes. Our farmers are prepared to do the hard yards to put in these nature-based solutions. Does my honourable friend agree with me that they need support and certainty from the government to achieve that?
Of course I agree. It's absolutely right. That's the basis behind my seeking this debate, is to highlight the need for continued, this isn't new government support, it's continued government support. We have a Brexit dividend of the environmental land management scheme. It would be a crying shame if the government failed to build on the very good work of the last government, and I'll come on to that in a minute, because we have the flagship scheme. We've got elms. We had in the last government a commitment which was honoured of £2.4 billion every year from 2019 onwards to support the transition from area-based payments to public money for public goods. You've got the SFI for soil quality, water quality, hedgerow, tree planting, riparian buffers. You've got the countryside stewardship scheme, and then you've got the landscape recovery scheme, which I've already mentioned. And there are other schemes, the England Woodland Creation Offer and the Nature for Climate Fund. All these schemes backing up the transition for allowing farmers to recognise and mitigate against changes in nature, changes in rain distribution and intensity, and funding necessary changes, both for biodiversity but also for their own productive reasons, and I will give way. But I've got an eye on the time.
Thank you. I thank my honourable member for giving way. And as he's rightly highlighted, the very intricate and technical knowledge that is required to understand some of the mitigations for these things. And so I welcome our government's commitment to a flood resilience task force, but will he agree with me that it's integral that farmers themselves are involved every step of the way in that development of these solutions, particularly because of the changing nature of flooding?
Of course, I agree. I think my message to the government is that when you're dealing with flooding, particularly the environment agents, they need to do it in collaboration with farmers and get their agreement. If they're going to slow down a watercourse through a lack of clearance, then they need to recognise where that water is going to end up. And it's not just free flooding on on a neighbour's land who isn't a house. It actually has consequences for a business and also for our food security, and they need to work in collaboration with farmers and be prepared to pay if they're using the benefit of other people's land. And then I recognise up till now my entire speech has got nothing to do with the Minister's portfolio because she deals with flood defences, and I'm sure she's got a deep knowledge on farming, but it may not be quite deep enough to answer this. But now she'll be relieved to know I'm moving on to natural flood management schemes as part of the government's flood budget. £5.2 billion. The last government made a step, albeit a small one, in the right direction by allocating £25 million to natural flood management schemes. That needs to be increased because the lesson from those initial schemes is that they're very cheap, relatively speaking, and they're very effective. So why don't we do more of it and build on this Brexit dividend? And that leads me, Dr. Morrison, to the scary bit, which is the budget. I've got real concerns because although the Secretary of State for DEFRA has trumpeted his £5 billion over 2 years, which he says is to support agriculture, which he says is a record, the biggest ever. It's only the biggest ever, Dr. Morrison, if you ignore inflation, which none of the rest of us can, because that £5 billion would need to be £5.8 billion right across the 2 years and then after the rest, throughout the rest of the Parliament, in order to match the £2.4 billion equivalent from 2019 onwards. So we're already £800 million short over the course of the Parliament. And then what happens after 2026? Because it's said in the budget that the future financial pressures of £600 million will require a review into affordability. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean it's the end of arms? So are we going to take a cut back on all these nature-friendly farming without reassurance from the Minister and from in particular the Treasury? Farmers are looking at this and saying there's a cliff edge. There's a cliff edge at the end of 2026. You've got 2 years of £5 billion, which is actually less in real money than they had before, and then a huge fall-off. So that's a terrible message on top of the family farm tax, where you're having cuts to nature-friendly farming. Where does this go? And it's the opposite of what the manifesto commitment of the Honourable Lady opposite was, which was an expansion of nature-rich habitats. So I asked the Minister, can she commit to the Water Restoration Fund? Yesterday I sat on the Water Special Measures Bill Committee, and new Clause 2, which was put forward in the name of the opposition and my name as well, to make sure that the Water Restoration Fund was enshrined in law, was voted down by the government. That gives me and farmers a real cause for concern. And can she reassure farmers post-2027 that the funding for farming and for nature-friendly farming in particular is going to be index-linked? Because at the moment it falls off a cliff. Can she rule out cuts? Can she allocate, and this is perhaps more in her personal remit, an increased percentage of the flooding budget to nature-based solutions, because they've been proven to be effective and they work to compensate farmers if they're going to assist in the creation of them? And can she enable private sector investment in natural capital markets, get the quangos out of the way, let them set standards, certainly, but then allow the market in nature credits to flourish? Manifesto words do not mitigate flooding or support farmers. What does is long-term funding and long-term incentives, and I look forward to the Minister's response.
Minister. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'm delighted to contribute to this debate with the Honourable Member for Broadland and Fakenham, though I feel like at the moment we're spending more time together than I am with my own family, with the Bill Committee and then another debate, and I look forward to round 3 or 4. Our secrets, yes, tomorrow. And I really enjoyed his thoughtful contributions actually on soil and the importance of using soil in the right way and how farming practices can be updated. I thought that was a really valuable contribution. And as I mentioned to the House last week, and I'm sure people have heard me talk about this before, I am fully aware of the impact that flooding has to individual households, to the people impacted by it, the impact it has on their mental health, and of course, importantly, to farmland. And I have extreme and deep sympathy with farmers who've had so much of their crop underwater during this season and how that's impacted yield. And the storms this winter highlight the urgent need for many of us to adapt to the threats of climate change, and not least, of course, farmers who often feel these impacts directly. And as climate change leads to more extreme rainfall, as has been mentioned, the number of people at risk from flooding and coastal erosion will continue to grow. So I would like to make it abundantly clear that this new government is committed to tackling this challenge. It is one of our top 5 core priorities for DEFRA, and the good news is work has already begun. Recognising the significant impact of flooding on farmers, the government is bolstering England's resilience to flooding by confirming an additional £50 million for internal drainage boards to improve assets. This is on top of the existing £25 million, taking total investment to £75 million. This transformational investment will put IDBs on a firm footing to deliver their vital role in flood and water management. This will benefit projects that will improve, repair or replace IDB assets, including flood barriers, embankments and, of course, as we mentioned, maintenance of watercourses. Projects will reduce risks and impacts from flooding to farmers and rural communities across England. And to ensure we protect the country from the devastating impacts of flooding, we are investing £2.4 billion in 24-25 and 25-26 to improve flood resilience by building, maintaining and repairing flood defences. But I do just gently point out to the honourable gentleman that this government did inherit our flood defence assets in the worst condition on record, and it is important, therefore, that we have to come in and deal with that maintenance backlog. I'll give way and then I'll give way. But I have only got 6 minutes.
Could I thank the Minister and thank you, Dr Merson, for allowing me in. I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point. In my area, a major flood prevention scheme in Caversham, which is part of the Greater Reading area, was unfortunately deferred. However, there is some good news in terms of some of the points that she made and the honourable gentleman made about landowners working together. And I visited Kennet Meadows and New Fobney Meadows and saw 3 different landowners working together to rewild an area of flood meadow to enhance the land's ability to soak up water. And there's much that can be done with government, both central and local, playing a leading role in coordinating work with landowners, building a team approach at a local level.
I thank my honourable friend, and that sounds like an excellent example. And if the honourable lady doesn't mind, I did note she intervened on the honourable gentleman, and so if she's okay, I'll use the last 5 minutes because I do want to answer respond to some of the comments that have been made. To continue, we are looking at reviewing the flood funding formula. This was something that was brought up by farmers on many of the visits I did when I was in shadow position. And this is something that I want to work with all the various stakeholders on, to recognise that the flooding formula at the moment, in my opinion, disincentivises investment in rural areas, and that's something that I want to have a serious look at. But to talk about, and I hate to see an outbreak of almost sort of unity in here after, but it's nice to have sometimes, Dr Morrison. But there's much love on this side for natural flood management, so I was very welcomed the comments made by the honourable gentleman. We champion and support natural flood management, and I'm keen to explore how we can encourage more right across the whole of England. I have therefore convened a roundtable on Monday to explore opportunities and challenges to the delivery of natural flood management. This will help inform our natural flood management delivery, including experts and those directly involved in the projects. And I look forward to hearing from farming representatives as part of that discussion. And I've invited the National Farming Union, the Nature Friendly Farming Network and the Country Land and Business Association, and I'm keen to hear how their views can feed into government work. And as we mentioned, there are various ways that natural flood management can be used to protect flooded farmland, such as planting winter cover crops, soil management, matching grazing density to the capability of the land, avoiding growing certain crops on steep slopes, blocking drainage, and blocking drainage ditches to slow down runoff, create wetland habitats. And there'll be measures that benefit flood mitigation in all three of the environmental land management schemes: sustainable farming initiative, countryside stewardship and landscape recovery.
Projects,
yes.
But farmers plan long in advance. It's not an 18 or 24-month process, and if the funding runs out in 2 years and there's no visibility beyond that, how are they expected to invest in these schemes? Just to reassure him that the government is committed to the environmental land management programme, and we are looking at funding natural flood management on farmland. And as I say, we're having our meeting on Monday to discuss with farmers what more we can do in terms of natural flood management. And part of our vision for farming is a sector that recognises that restoring nature is not in competition with sustainable food production. And on that point, I agree with the Honourable Gentleman, but actually essential to it. Restoring nature helps food production. We will provide farmers and land managers with the support they need to help restore nature, which is vital to safeguard our long-term food security, support productivity and build resilience to climate change. This means carrying on the transition away from payment for land ownership and towards payment for delivering public goods for the environment, and continuing to use regulation to require minimum standards which will be designed in partnership, and that's an important point, with farmers, and sufficient lead-in times as well, given for change. The Countryside and Stewardship Scheme already has specific flood resilience options, such as making space for water. And I will just sort of flag we have our land use framework as well, which will be coming out at some point. And this year we're introducing new actions with flood mitigation benefits to our combined environmental land management offer. This includes actions to reduce flood risk, restore and enhance floodplains and better storage of flood water. To sum up, I would like to reiterate that this government is dedicated to exploring ways that nature-based solutions on flooded farmland can be delivered for the benefit of farmers and others. We've already taken decisive action by taking the first steps to reviewing the outdated funding formula, by creating the new multi-agency flood resilience task force, and by updating flood options under the environmental land management schemes. And I look forward to continuing to engage with farmers on these incredibly important matters. So I'm grateful for this important debate and to have heard the views of those in the room today.
The question is that this House has considered nature-based solutions for farmland flooding. As many as that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.